The 10 Plagues of Egypt, Divine Intervention or Natural Phenomena. Today we're diving into one of the most mysterious and fascinating stories from the Bible, the 10 Plagues of Egypt. A dramatic tale where divine intervention challenges the will of a stubborn Pharaoh, forever altering the fate of an entire nation. The book of Exodus describes a series of calamities inflicted upon Egypt, each more devastating than the last. Were these plagues acts of God, a display of raw supernatural power meant to liberate the Israelites from slavery? Or could there be another explanation, one rooted in the natural world? Join me as we journey back in time, sifting through history and scientific evidence in search of answers. Blood, the Nile turns red. Our story begins with the Nile River, the lifeblood of Egypt, transforming into a river of blood. Fish died, the air filled with the stench of decay, and the Nile, once a source of life, became a harbinger of death. The Bible tells us this was the first plague, a devastating blow intended to soften Pharaoh's heart. But could there be a scientific explanation? Some scholars point to a natural phenomenon known as a red tide, caused by a surge in red algae. These microscopic organisms can bloom in vast numbers, staining the water a deep blood red and releasing toxins that kill fish. Could this natural phenomenon be the culprit behind the biblical account of the Nile turning to blood? Frogs and Amphibian Invasion. As if the blood-red Nile wasn't enough, Egypt was soon overrun by a second plague: frogs. Frogs everywhere, in the streets, homes, even the Pharaoh's palace. The Bible presents this as another sign of God's power, a deliberate torment upon the Egyptians. However, some scientists believe this plague could have been triggered by the first. The massive die-off of fish in the Nile, caused by the red tide, would have disrupted the ecosystem. Frogs, deprived of their primary food source, would have been forced to leave the river in search of sustenance. This mass exodus would have driven them into villages and towns, desperate for survival. Gnats, a plague of biblical proportions. The Nile, now choked with rotting fish and amphibians, became a breeding ground for insects. The third plague, a plague of gnats, descended upon Egypt. These tiny insects, a nuisance under normal circumstances, became a relentless torment, swarming in thick clouds. The Bible describes them as a plague sent by God, a punishment for Pharaoh's stubbornness. But could this infestation have a more earthly explanation? The massive die-off of fish and frogs, coupled with warm, humid conditions, would have created a perfect breeding ground for insects. Their populations would have exploded, swarming over everything in their path. This ecological imbalance, a direct consequence of the previous plagues, would have had devastating consequences for the Egyptians. Chapter 4. Flies, Carriers of Pestilence. The line between natural disaster and divine retribution blurred as Egypt faced the fourth plague, a plague of flies. The air, thick with the stench of decay, buzzed with these winged harbingers of disease. They swarmed through the streets, invaded homes, and tormented both humans and animals alike. The Bible paints a vivid picture of this infestation, but what if this plague had a more earthly origin? The decaying carcasses of fish and frogs, coupled with the burgeoning insect population, would have created ideal breeding conditions for flies. These insects, drawn to the rotting flesh, would have multiplied exponentially, their numbers swelling into a terrifying swarm. And these flies, feasting on the decaying matter, would have become carriers of disease, spreading sickness and pestilence wherever they landed. Chapter 5. Livestock disease, a nation's livelihood decimated. The fifth plague struck at the heart of Egypt's economy and survival, a devastating pestilence that swept through their livestock. Imagine the despair of the Egyptians as their cattle, sheep, and horses, their livelihoods, began to sicken and die. The Bible describes a swift and merciless plague, a targeted attack on the animals that sustained the Egyptians. While the Bible attributes this plague to God's wrath, could there be a scientific explanation? The previous plagues, with their swarms of insects and the spread of disease, could hold the key. The flies, feasting on the decaying carcasses of fish and frogs, would have become vectors for bacteria and viruses. These disease-carrying insects, landing on livestock, could have easily spread infections, leading to a widespread epidemic. Chapter 6. Boils, a Painful Affliction. The sixth plague brought the wrath of the plagues home, afflicting the Egyptians themselves with painful and debilitating boils. The Bible describes these boils as a divine retribution, a painful reminder of Pharaoh's defiance. While the Bible offers a supernatural explanation, could there be a scientific basis for this outbreak? The unsanitary conditions created by the previous plagues, coupled with the proliferation of disease-carrying insects, would have created a breeding ground for illness. The flies, having feasted on decaying matter and infected animals, would have carried bacteria and viruses on their bodies. These pathogens, transferred to humans through bites or contact with contaminated surfaces, could have caused skin infections manifesting as painful boils. Chapter 7. Hail and Fire, Fury from the Heavens. The heavens unleashed their fury upon Egypt as the seventh plague arrived in a terrifying display of hail and fire. Imagine the terror as giant hailstones, some mixed with fire, rained down from the sky, destroying crops, shattering trees, and crushing anything in their path. The Bible describes this event as a storm of biblical proportions, an act of divine wrath that showcased the destructive power of God. While the Bible attributes this to God's anger, could there be a more scientific explanation for this meteorological anomaly? Some scientists believe that a volcanic eruption, even one occurring in a distant land, could have triggered this destructive event. Volcanic eruptions can eject massive amounts of ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. These particles can be carried thousands of miles by wind currents, affecting weather patterns across the globe, leading to heavy rainfall and hailstorms. As if the hail and fire weren't devastating enough, Egypt was soon engulfed by the eighth plague, a swarm of locusts so vast it blotted out the sun. Imagine the horror as these hungry insects descended upon the land, devouring every green plant in sight. The Bible describes the locusts as an unstoppable force, stripping fields bare and leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. But could there be a scientific explanation for this sudden and devastating infestation? Locusts, while individually harmless, can transform into a destructive force when environmental conditions trigger their swarming behavior. The previous plagues, with their impact on weather patterns and the disruption of ecosystems, could have created the perfect conditions for a locust plague. The heavy rains and warm temperatures following the hailstorm would have created ideal breeding grounds for these insects. Once their numbers reached a critical mass, locusts would transform, becoming highly gregarious and forming massive swarms that could stretch for miles. A palpable darkness descended upon Egypt, a darkness so thick it felt almost tangible. It lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. Imagine the fear as the sun god Ra disappeared, plunging the land into unsettling blackness. The Bible describes this darkness as one that could be felt, permeating every corner of Egypt. Some scientists believe a dense sandstorm could have caused this event. Imagine the wind carrying millions of tons of sand, blotting out the sun. The 10th and final plague was the most devastating, a plague that cut to the very heart of every Egyptian family, the death of the firstborn. Imagine the collective grief, the cries of anguish echoing through the streets as the firstborn in every household, from the humblest peasant to the Pharaoh himself, succumbed to an unseen hand. The Bible tells us that this plague, unlike the others, spared the Israelites. Their homes, marked with the blood of a lamb, were passed over by the angel of death. The death of the firstborn, while shrouded in mystery, has also been explored through the lens of scientific inquiry. Some theories suggest that a particularly virulent disease, one that disproportionately affected young children, could have swept through Egypt. Others point to the possibility of food poisoning. If a particular food source, one favored by firstborn children, became contaminated, it could explain the selective nature of this plague. While we may never know the exact cause of this final plague, its impact is undeniable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the 10 plagues of Egypt, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the plagues? Were they divine intervention or natural disasters? The answer, much like the ancient world from which this story originates, remains a mystery. But perhaps, the true power of this story lies not in finding definitive answers, but in the questions it continues to raise.